I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. We're going to begin here today by taking a smaller flat-headed brush. This one is about 1/4 inch. I'm going to grab quite a bit of titanium white, move that to a fresh spot here on our palette. Then I'll grab about maybe 1/3 of that, maybe a little bit less of our cadmium yellow deep hue. Then I'll go to the farthest spot here in the distance and we'll start painting in some golden light. I'm using this brush because it can carry a good amount of pigment and because it renders a really nice sharp line, as you can see here on our horizon. But I'm just going to fill all of this in, and I'm going to go back and do it a couple of times. That way we build up our pigment, because acrylic paints are innately semi-transparent. I'm also picking a couple areas kind of up to the top left and top right where that light is also going to be shining through additional clouds. Now we'll get quite a bit closer, and with that same damp brush I'm going to start taking some cadmium red light hue and some cadmium yellow deep hue. We'll mix those together so that we get a hint of orange in that red. Then we'll make it significantly brighter by matching our red and yellow with an equal amount of titanium white. Then with this new peachish, orangish pink, we are going to start working in some clouds right above our light. You can see that I'm using that sharp edge to create some clouds that kind of work their way out into the light, and you can even blend it with that yellow. If you do, it'll look like you have a slightly more thin cloud where the light is passing through, and it can create this really nice transparent effect. Make that light feel warm, just very natural in its environment. Here you can see I'm working around some of the openings of light that we painted, just like that. And we'll also move it up right behind this larger purple cloud that we'll work in just a minute. There we go. You can see that I'm really moving around a lot. I'm trying to create a lot of diversity in the sky and make it continuously engaging. You don't want it to be too simple or boring. With that, I am quite a fan of that pigment, but it's time to start making it a little bit brighter as we get higher up. So I'll take additional titanium white, work that in a bit more, starting to blend it farther down, that way it blends less and less with the red. Now that we have a nice pink, work that right up here. So we're working in quite a tight space, but we already have a lot of varying color and transitions in the sky. I'm trying to get a smooth blend between this one and this one, so I'm going over it with a couple of these very soft horizontal strokes. And I'll even work a bit of that extra light here and a little bit up here. Now we're going to remix a little bit of our pinkish orange that we used for the majority of that first set of clouds, and I'm going to test it initially up in those clouds to make sure that it is quite similar, looks so, and I'm going to take that now and apply that right on the horizon line of our water. I'm doing this so that we have a bit of a nice reflection coming down from that sky, and that warmth works its way in here. It's going to make the piece look quite cohesive and add some nice symmetry as well. I am making the pigment a little bit darker, as you've probably noticed. And that's just because the water is almost always darker than the sky and what it reflects. Now, while the pigment's darker, which is what I wanted, I do feel it's a little bit too red, so we'll add just a hint of white and yellow back into that mix, and we'll give this another try. We definitely have a more diverse color now. It's more interesting. Still cohesive with the top, which is great. But I think we do need to keep editing. And this is something I highly implore you to do. If you aren't initially entirely pleased with what you've achieved, go back, give it another go. Acrylics are incredibly forgiving. You can go over them in just minutes as they dry so quickly. And you might as well just keep working on it until you have what you want. Now, for our next step, I want to use some blue. However, our water and our brush are tinted by a little bit of yellow, and if we were to use this water and this brush with blue mixes right now, we'd probably get a little bit of green in there. So I'm going to go and clean these thoroughly, then we'll be right back and continue working on the sky. Now I'm going to take a damp filbert brush. This one is about 1/2 inch, and it's quite similar to a flat-headed brush, except it doesn't have any sharp edges, so it's great for working around soft subjects like our clouds. I'm going to take quite a bit of titanium white and the smallest hint of cerulean blue. We'll mix those together. As you can see, the cerulean has quite an effect. I'll take some additional titanium white, make it just a bit brighter, like that. And I'll start working this right around the tops of our clouds. And we're just going to continue diversifying the colors in our sky. We will have to do a little bit of a transition between this pigment and the pinks that we have down there, but I'm going to do that in a little bit. Right now, I'm just going to start establishing this pigment, make sure it is what I want it to be, and work it out in all directions. There we go. You can barely notice it on camera, which is exactly what we want. Then I'll grab that first mixture and I'll start working that along our edges. This is going to be a little bit brighter vibrancy wise. It's actually not as bright. The value is darker, but it's going to be more saturated and it'll catch more visual attention. Now we're going to continue moving outwards, but I'll get you a little bit closer, that way you can see the blending. So now we're going to take more of that cerulean blue, a hint of Mars black, not much, I'm taking off the excess, and some titanium white. This will mix a grayish blue, and we'll start working this along those edges and blending it back into that which we've previously applied. If you work with softer strokes, you'll get much more subtle blends. There we go. And I'm just going to continue moving this along and starting to create a soft gradient. And the whole idea here really is that we have this really bright light coming from here, and as we move farther and farther out, it gets darker and darker. We'll need to mix a bit more pigment. I'll work it right beside / on top our initial mixture, that way I know if I'm close, or if I need to make any changes. Here you can see that's significantly more gray. So we'll add more blue, we'll add some more white, and there we have a slightly darker version, which is great. We can add that to the edge. And just start blending that. Make it a little bit brighter for the transition. And just keep things soft. Trying to make lots of smaller strokes, that way if any strokes do show through, it looks like this really nice painterly effect. And here you can see this pigment is getting quite chalky. It's no longer blending with that brighter pigment that we used. So I'll mix something that's brighter, and I'll create that transition again. So build up more layers of paint, and in the end that actually will look really nice. I think a lot of us initially, when working with acrylics, we get a little scared, I guess, that our pigments are going to dry too quickly, and we just kind of rush through it. But rushing doesn't help all that much. What you really want to do is your best job in the time that you have, and then again, if things start to dry, you know what, we'll get more of a bright mixture, apply that down there, and continue that blend. I think I also want to extend it a little bit brighter down here. Initially you could see that scraping back and forth, but I do quickly move back into the individual strokes. That way again, if you see brush strokes, they look natural. Anyways, I'm just going to get a little bit darker as we move up towards that corner. A bit more Mars Black, Titanium White. I'll adjust a little bit. Mars Black is an extremely strong pigment, so you don't need much. There we go. Now I would like to note that I did switch to a 1-inch larger flat-headed brush just to start smoothing everything out a little bit. I'm applying very minimal amounts of pressure, and this is just giving me a slightly more consistent look. If you find that you don't love the more painterly effect where you can see the brush strokes, this is a great alternative. Just recognize that both options are out there and neither of which are right or wrong. It's wholly subjective and up to personal preference. But there you can see we took something that looked a little bit more splotchy and we turned it into something rather soft. I'm also taking these pigments and I'm working them over to this side. I have a couple little openings as well, and that's just going to help us further diversify our painting. There we go. It's also worth noting that my brush is still relatively damp, and that's just so I can extend the wet life of my paint, and it helps me get these blends a little bit smoother when I have to cover a larger portion of space. There we go. Now I'm switching over to the 1/4 inch flat-headed brush, and what we need to do now is start combining this and this with this right here. So we're going to mix a very bright pink pigment. So there I have some titanium white. I'll move that down to a relatively clean spot here on my palette. I'll grab the smallest amount of cadmium red light hue, mix those together, and I'm looking for something that has a similar value to that. This looks a little bit darker, so I'll grab more titanium white, mix that up right there, a little bit more, and I think that should be good, if not a little bit brighter. So what I'll do, I'll take this, I'll initially work it back on top of our orangish pink, do that over here as well, and then once those are applied, I'll move it up into our sky, which may or may not be still wet. If it's wet, you'll get a fairly easy blend. If it isn't, just add a bit more water to your brush and it'll allow you to paint wet over dry. But here you can see it's incredibly soft, it's barely noticeable, but it's just this small hint of warmth worked into the sky. And now it connects both areas of our painting. You can also take a little bit more and go over these again, because when you work a lighter pigment over a darker pigment, generally because acrylics are semi-transparent, you see that darker pigment through it, and you don't get the actual pigment that you have here on your palette. At least not initially. You need to build up those layers, so the layer that shows through underneath is significantly brighter. So we're just working this down, making sure it's cohesive, and then we can proceed. Now I'm going to take a pointed round brush and I'll start working in the clouds in the background. But this is a fairly new brush for us and the channel. I'm using it because that point at the top will give me some nice sharp edges to clouds when I want them. But in general, my applications are going to be quite soft because we don't have any sharp edges like that of a flat-headed brush. With that said, you don't need to use this. Alternatively, you could use a regular round-headed brush or a flat-headed brush. Just recognize that you will have to work with some sharper, more distinct edges with this, and that you won't get as sharp edges with this. I'm playing with a lot of brushes in this lesson just because I feel like we generally use the same ones, and there is a lot of variety out there. So recognize you don't have to use exactly what I'm using, but if you want to play around with it a little bit more, you can. So we're going to begin at the bottom of our clouds here and work our way up, but this bottom area is going to have a slightly different color than the top. Here we'll have slightly more of a purplish pink. Here we'll have more of a blue as we get farther away from those warmer colors. So let's start here by taking a little bit of our cadmium red light hue, a little bit of our cerulean blue. We'll mix up a nice bluish purple here. Whenever you mix purple with a red and a blue, it'll probably lean one way or the other, and with this one we want slightly more blue in it than red. So there we go. Looks pretty good. Now we'll make it a little bit less saturated. We'll throw in some titanium white, small hint of Mars black, like that. It'll also thicken the pigment because titanium white is quite thick, so we won't have to do as much layering. Then, once I have what I want, I'll come and I'll test it and I'll say, you know what? That's a little bit darker than what I actually wanted. So I'm going to, just now, clean my brush, take that pigment off, and I'll mix something brighter than what we just had. So we'll take some red, we'll take some blue, and that's also why you don't mix a lot of pigment initially, because if that was wrong, it would be a lot of pigment to fix. And we'll grab a hint of titanium white and Mars black. Give this a go. That is so much better. That's perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to wait for that to dry to go over that area again. That way I don't mix all of that dark pigment in with this color I actually do really like right here. And I'm going to start working my way around all of our open areas of sky. Now that I have a pigment that I know I like, I can mix a lot more of it. So I'll grab a lot of titanium white, quite a bit of our blue and red, a little bit of Mars black. You can tell that this is significantly more blue than our previous mixture. That's why you always mix right beside. It's a little bit brighter, but I think I'm okay with that. There we go. Now I'm working it right in between. I'll use that nice sharp head to do some detail work in here, like that. Using a very soft touch of the brush. And I'm also going to make sure that my brush is relatively damp, that way rendering those softer impressions is quite easy. Here we'll have a little bit of a moving cloud down that way. Some clouds that separate. This should be dry, so as you can see, I'm just working on top of that now. It's good to have patience with this. You don't have to have much because acrylics do dry so quickly, so you might as well take the extra minute here and there when it's advantageous. There we go. I am, of course, just following the reference photo, which you can find up over on Patreon if you'd like to use that. But of course, you're more than welcome to just follow along with the lesson here. But I like to use the reference photo just so that I don't kind of continuously do the same thing. Generally, when we come up with scenes in our head, we simplify things. We end up doing the same thing over and over because it's kind of the compacted version of what we assume the subject looks like. But when you're working from a photo, you see all of these things you wouldn't think to incorporate. All of these changes, all of the little elements that make it look natural or real. So even if you are doing your own painting, I do recommend finding a series of reference photos and kind of combining them. That way you get to integrate elements you wouldn't have thought of previously. Notice how soft this is right here. We want some areas to be more opaque and some areas to be less opaque. So here, I'm using less pressure with my brush, and it's giving me a slightly more soft transition. If you find your brush starts to get a little bit dry, and you see the tooth of the canvas, just add a bit more water to your brush, and that should remedy that issue. You can also see that all of the points in these clouds are going in this direction, which gives us some leading lines, makes the piece consistent, and also alludes to wind. I'm now just going to go in and fill the rest of that out, and then I will see you for adding some depth to all of these clouds. So I noted that the next time we started working on this together, we would be adding the depth and the highlights, the shadows, and all of that. But initially, I also mentioned that we wanted the bottom of this to be more purple, and then the top to slowly turn more blue. And I wanted to show you what I meant. So here, I have a slightly more blue mixture. It still has a hint of red in it. But I'm applying this to the top. I'm filling out this cloud the way that we want it. Because I'm using this brush, I can get those nice little sharp applications that are moving up. And you can see that the lines are going like that in the clouds. But when I get down here, I'm using a damp brush, so I can blend this atop our previously dry mixtures. And I'm applying it, as you can see, predominantly to the tops of these clouds. That way, we do have something that's much more of a blue up here, and then as you move down, it progressively gets less and less blue, and it gets warmer, because we're getting closer to that sunset. It's a very simple process, but it makes a really big difference. See that? If you find that you're getting a lot of blue, you can simply take a wet brush without any additional pigment and start working that down as well. Now, we've been talking a lot about the direction of our clouds and how initially they were moving that way and then they're starting to move up like that, and you can see that in all of these little points. But right after this hump right here, it starts to move that way. So now you can see that I'm going to start moving it in a different direction. And again, it just shows that it's always evolving, makes it much more captivating to the eye. And you know what, while we're here, I think I'll also show you how we get some more of these soft effects as well. So I'm going to start with the damp brush. Here you can see that I have a lot of hard edges that are moving up. I'll grab more of that pigment, but not much. and with a very wet brush, I'll apply a very minimal amount of pressure. I start down in the cloud and then I lift up, like that. And you can see that it gives me these semi-transparent strokes. And the goal is to create a gradient from the fully opaque cloud to something that essentially just disappears. And that means you'll probably have to go over the middle portion a couple of times. And this is something that does take a little bit of practice, but it's really nice when you can get that really different opacity in it, because what this does, it makes it look like the edges are slightly transparent. There's more light that can move through them, and so it makes the cloud immediately look more three-dimensional without even adding a variety of values, which we are going to go and do in a second. But you can also do little clouds and little pieces that kind of come off the edges here. It doesn't just need to be larger clouds. So these are just different fun things you can play with. And here you can see I'm almost out of paint, so I'm getting this extremely transparent application, which is nice because it makes it look like a thin cloud that's very, very far away. There we go. Anyways, now again, I am going to finish this. I'll probably throw a couple clouds up here, and then I'll show you exactly where I put them so that you can apply yours as well. So, as you can see, I went ahead and worked in the bodies of these additional clouds. They all still move in the same direction as this cloud right here. You can see that these move off, and then these kind of meet them with that same line. The same goes for these ones over here. And we made this edge a bit darker to create a little bit of a vignette and draw the eye in towards the light. With that, we are going to continue working on our clouds, and we're going to start giving these some depth. Now, in this scene, we have a nice sunset, but it's pretty interesting because we have a lot of light up here, which is going to be working its way down on these clouds. So the tops of the clouds are actually going to be receiving quite a bit more light, and the body of the cloud, which is the most dense area where light can't pass through, is going to be a little bit darker. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a bit more of that purple that we mixed, but we're going to make it a little bit brighter. So I'll start with my red, I'll grab a little bit of my blue here, titanium white, we'll need a hint of Mars black. It's always good to use a little bit of Mars black and titanium white in your pigments, so that way they aren't too saturated. Keeps everything kind of a little more realistic. And then I'll say, okay, you know what, there's going to be additional light at the top of this cloud, so I'll start tapping that right along there. Now, if you look at this, it really is a little bit more purple than we want, so I'll throw in a hint more blue, not much, and I'm also going to make it significantly brighter. Why? Because the initial mixture I had on my palette was what I wanted, but when I apply it over this dark pigment, I get something new. So to compensate for the fact that we are applying on top of a darker paint, I'm making my pigment brighter. So here you can see I'm kind of dancing around the tops of these clouds with this lighter pigment. And this is going to create some depth in them because it makes it look like the light is coming, it's hitting the tops of the clouds, it's working its way around, and it's making it a three-dimensional subject. Whenever you want to make something three-dimensional in your paintings, you just wrap light around it. So we figure out where that light is coming from, we apply light on the side of the subject that it will be touching, and then we create a little bit of a gradient working into the darker areas. So here you can see I'm doing a bit of a wet over dry blend. And you know what, we'll get you a little bit closer again. So here, when we get up close, you can really notice that change. And we're going to further personify it by adding additional titanium white into our mixture. Coming back up to the tops of that top area we just worked on, and we'll brighten it even more. The brush is exceptionally wet, so Here you can see I'm just blending down into completely dry pigment and building form in our clouds. You can leave little openings in areas in between, as I did there, to give it some extra depth. And I'm going to go over a couple of these areas a number of times because, again, every time you're working on top of a darker pigment, you'll need to do a couple layers to really build it up to what you want it to be. Here we'll mix a bit more. We know essentially what we want. We know we still need a hint of Mars black, and we'll make that brighter. There we go. Look at that. Perfect. And now it looks like what we have here is really just getting lost in the sky, and that's exactly what we want. It's a really beautiful transition. And it's all starting to make sense and come together. Whenever you're painting skies with a lot of different colors, they go through a lot of stages, some of which significantly more awkward than others, and that's okay. Just recognize that it is one of those subjects that really starts to come together at the end of the process, so don't get discouraged halfway through thinking it doesn't look right. It's not meant to. Some subjects are, some subjects do. Skies with a lot of different colors are generally in that category. Or generally not in that category, rather. Oh my, got a little distracted. Started working on this area, had an idea, started going really well, and all of my other ideas just kind of left the building. Went to a beach with a beautiful sky. Using my finger occasionally to blend, as you can see. And I would like to note, for those of you who are on Patreon and using the reference photo and traceable, yes, I am changing the colors from the initial photo a little bit. I'm making this more pink and purple. It's important to know that you can take artistic liberties, make changes when you have a new idea, you like that idea, you like how the painting's going. Don't feel like you have to follow everything to a T. The reference photos, the traceables, they're there to help you, to aid you with the drawing and color mixing process, but you don't have to follow every portion of them. You can interject pieces of yourselves and make it your own as well. It goes for all of my lessons. Don't ever feel like you have to follow it perfectly. I love it when I see different renditions with entirely new ideas or takes on it. Anyways, we're going to have less and less of this highlight as we move up our cloud, but we're still going to have a little bit of it. So I'll just let this dissipate as I move upwards along the edge. So here you can really see that transition from pink up into the darker blue, but from there we're going to work on a significantly more soft and subtle cloud, one that has a lot of light working through it, and one that's going to add a lot of color diversity to this open blue patch in our sky. So we're going to be working on some wispy clouds here. I'm still going to be using this brush because, again, it does give me a soft application but also a sharp line when I want one. And for this, we are going to take quite a bit of our cadmium red light hue, a little bit of our cerulean blue, definitely more red than blue, but not too much. Then a lot of titanium white, and we want to create something really quite bright and something similar to the value that we have right in the middle portion right there. So this right here looks quite good. We'll add a little bit more blue. We do need a hint of Mars black, which will darken it. We may need to brighten it after this, but something we do have to do. That looks really nice. I like that. Okay, so right now I have a very dry brush with a lot of pigment on it. That is not useful. So I'm going to clean my brush in some water, just wipe off that excess right now. Come back in with a clean, damp brush. I'll grab some of that pigment. Now there really isn't much on the brush. And I know the camera's a little bit far away for this, but I wanted to show you the whole sky as this progresses, so it's kind of necessary right now. But with that, I'm going to give this a little bit of a test. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. You know what, I think it needs to be a hint darker. A little bit more Mars Black. This is why we don't mix up a lot of pigment initially. I'll give that a try. That's more of what I wanted. Okay, so yet again, because I mixed, I took that paint off. Now I'm coming back in with some water. And as you can see, my applications here are incredibly thin. You can see the blue through this pigment. And that's exactly what we want. We want something that has the light moving fully through it. You can see the other colors of the sky. I'm working this up this way until it just kind of gets lost. But I'm also working the majority of my strokes that way. That way, when you kind of move up with your eye through this, you might catch that. You work your way to here. Those leading lines bring you back down. There's really quite a bit to it and the line work in the sky, but I love complicated skies like this. I just think they're so captivating. You can look at them for hours. So that's what we're doing. We are making something with the intent to captivate for a really extended period of time. Letting it get lost up here again. Gets it less and less prominent, less and less opaque. Connect it over into this. And start moving it down in the same movements that we have there. If you don't like anything you applied, you can just simply take your finger and smooth it out. Because it's so watery, it really will be easy to move around. And now I think we need a bit more pigment. So red, blue, black, white. While we have a lot of colors and mixes happening here, they're all fairly similar in that they all use all of the same mixing colors. And that way they're cohesive. Here you can see I'm going over previously applied areas, and it's making it darker because we're building up that pigment. And if you find it's too dark, you can just work it out with water. See? So malleable. Now, while we might want to go back a little bit later and clean up a couple of areas in the sky, before we do that, I do want to start working more on the rest of the painting. That way I know how much detail I want to incorporate in that sky in the end. So we're going to head in to this landmass right here. I'm going to be using the 1/4 inch flat-headed brush because I do want some nice sharp edges. And for this, we're going to take quite a bit of Mars Black here. I'm going to take a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, no, not yellow, blue, and some titanium white as well. We'll create a very dark base layer here that leans towards purple. Then I'll just start applying this right in to these land masses. And you can see that I'm using the corner of the brush occasionally just to create a very sharp little impression. Of course, we'll be able to use that nice sharp edge for the bottom as well. So we work around that horizon. And whenever I'm applying a silhouette-like subject like this, I generally like to start on the edges while I have a lot of very clean paint. And then when I start to run out, like now, I'll work a little bit more down into the middle of it. And that's just because as you run out of paint, you're not able to deliver as sharp of lines. And right now, when we work on the edges, we want that. When we work in the middle, it doesn't really matter. We can go back in here and fill this in really any time. So here you can see I filled that in. I'm now going to head back to my water dish, make sure my brush is nice and damp. We'll grab more of that pigment, and now that I have some new paint, I'll head back up to this right here. Just realized my hand may have been in the way. If it was, I truly do apologize. That does tend to happen once in a while, painting on weird angles, but here, as you can see, we're just working our way around that edge. And I'm doing all of these vertical strokes, that way I have the impression of hundreds of miniature trees here. And that way we add some life to the painting, subtly. Now I'm starting to run out of pigment, as you can see. Start working that in, but I don't even have enough to work in. So, I think what we'll do while that's still wet is just take some new pigment, go to the bottom of those strokes, and work that back down. I'm going to go ahead and fill in the rest of this, and then together we'll add some detail. Now that we have our base layer worked in, we're going to start doing some detail work and taking the light that's being emitted over here and wrapping it this way. So the left-hand side will be significantly brighter. The right-hand side will slowly get a little bit darker. And we're going to be painting both exposed rock as well as some foliage. So we're going to use the purplish pigment that we used initially. I'm using that pointed round-headed brush, and we're going to create a brighter version of that. So, mixing it right beside so I have a good guess of what it'll look like, recognizing that it will be slightly darker because we are working on top of a darker background. So that's what this looks like. It's not bad. But you know what, I think we should probably switch to a slightly smaller brush. That way we can be a little bit more detail oriented. So, this is the one I was just using. This is the one I'm switching to, I think. Let's see, what else do we have here? Yeah, we'll work with this one. So, this one I believe is about 1/10 of an inch, and it is a little bit smaller. I'm going to take some extra titanium white, work that into our mixture, go over to that edge, and that's much better. And I'm going to create these little rock walls that have slight highlights, and then they'll work their way back. But there are going to be openings and shadows. So I'm not going to paint all of it with this highlight. I'm going to find rock that I feel like might be moving down, catching a little bit of extra light, and then as we move towards the right, I'm doing a slight blend and softening it. You can also make your brush quite damp, and that will make that blend backwards significantly easier. There we are. Mix up a bit more of our pigments. Almost there. Here I'm using something a little bit darker, and I'm working behind those highlights. Now I'll switch back to that lighter pigment. Do some taps for some texture in our rock. And we'll have some rock walls in here as well. The farther back we move though, the less prominent we want these to be. So let your pigment start to run out a bit more, as well as using a bit more water, that way you get a softer impression. It's also ideal if you don't go over those areas too many times with pigment, as that will slowly build it up and make it brighter. Here we're doing a bit of an interesting rock movement, different from what we did before. I'm using the reference photo for a lot of this, but I'm also making my own changes. Good. Now I'll get you a little bit closer and we'll work on some foliage. Now I'm going to stick with the brush we've been using. I'll grab some of our cadmium yellow light hue. No, cadmium yellow deep hue. Though you could use a light hue if you wanted. It would just be a little bit less warm but a little bit more bright. I'll grab some Mars black and a hint of cerulean blue. The black and yellow will mix to make a green that's a bit more olivey. The yellow and the blue will make a more lush green. I'm combining all of them to give me a good balance. Grab a hint of titanium white, hint of Mars black. There we go. And now I'll just go in and I'll tap on different types of trees. Now these are very far away, so you'll just see the implications of them. But we'll do a couple of different kinds. We'll do some pine trees. So they'll be done with more of a vertical stroke. But then we'll also have more full trees that will do a series of little taps, leaving openings. And we'll work a lot of this around our previously applied rock. I'll let the edges be a bit brighter and more full because it'll have more light hitting it. And then as we work our way downwards, it'll get darker and darker. So that's when we'll let ourselves run out of paint. Now I'll take that yellow that we have, a little bit of our Mars black, a little bit of our cerulean blue, right there. Mix those together, and this time I'm going to use significantly more titanium white in the mixture because I want this to be a highlight for the top areas. And this is just going to be a nice little extra pigment that shows that light's running through these trees, and it'll build a little bit more dimension. Good. Really, really good. You can also do a couple down here, but not too many. Make sure that as you move towards the right-hand side, your paint dissipates, as again, you do want this side to be significantly darker. Just adding a hint here and there. Now as we step back, I'm really starting to feel like with how much dark pigment we have in here, we should probably make this cloud, that cloud, and a little bit of this just a little bit darker, but I don't want to commit to that right now. Again, I want to see how all of this progresses, and that'll tell us if we actually need to make any adjustments up there. But with that, we are now at the point where we can move to the bottom. Here I think a lot of us would naturally say, why don't you just continue the water that you've started here? And that's a good idea because, again, it's working background to foreground, but what I actually want to do is work the base coat in for all of the ground that we have in here, because if we started just painting that water, we'd probably lose the edges to everything we've kind of sketched in, and I'm really happy with how that looks. If we go ahead right now and we give it all a very dark base layer, because it is dark rock, then when we paint over it accidentally, as it inevitably will happen with our water, we probably will still see that edge because we'll be working a lighter pigment over a significantly darker pigment. So it'll be easy to touch up and continue working on. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work in all of this space here. I'm going to be using this smaller flat-headed brush. You can use a larger one, but I do want to be relatively precise. This one again is about 1/4 inch. And so I'll show you how we mix the colors and we'll get started. So we're going to begin here by looking at the darkest area of purplish pigment in our rock, because that is essentially how dark the base layer should be in the distance. And as we progressively move forward, we'll make it darker and darker. So I'm going to start with quite a bit of Mars black, some of our cadmium red, our cerulean blue. Throw those together. You can see that's nice and dark. We will need some titanium white though to nullify all of that saturation. I'll test it right up in here. I think it looks good. It's a little bit too blue. So we'll grab some extra red, work that in, test that, and that's much better. So for this, I'm going to start along the edges of the smaller rocks that I have. And right now, actually, I have a lot of pigment on my brush from the mixing process, and it's making it quite difficult to apply paint because it's just so much. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take all of that pigment off my brush, clean it in some water, make sure that it's nice and damp. Now I'll grab more of what we have. I know that always seems like we might be wasting paint, but you'll get such a sharper application if you take that extra time and you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of paint. So here you can see yet again doing the edges. Not too concerned about filling in the middle yet. That can happen as we start to run out of paint in a little bit. And then we start getting towards this larger rock. And these will be really fun to add some depth to in just a little bit. Here you can see I'm starting to run out of paint. It's getting chalky. So we're not going to continue and just drag that. We're going to head back to our palette and grab some more. It's important that this base layer is quite thick. Now that I know that I have the color that I want as well, we will make significantly more of it because we do have quite an area to cover. Also, as we move farther and farther away from the light here, we will make this more blue, just like the clouds. The closer you are to that sun, to that warm light, the more red your pigments will be in both your clouds and your rocks, and the farther away you get, the more that starts to change. So we have some little openings where we'll have water right there. We have another opening where some water will be pooling right here, and another right here. For the majority of these, I'm working in horizontal strokes that occasionally move up and down, but not diagonally. It just tends to give a slightly better aesthetic. Move around this one. You can also work in little areas for water later on. It's just easier to kind of pre-establish them now. Yet again, I want significantly more paint. You might want to use a palette knife to mix all of these paints, or just another larger brush, that way you don't have to consistently take off that pigment, but it's up to you. I am happy like this. So, continuing, got a little bit lost here. This should be filled in. I'm going to start filling in areas if it gets confusing, as I feel this did. And if you accidentally leave a couple little openings, that's okay. Those are actually great for additional detail later on. There we go. Continuously making sure my brush is nice and damp, because that's how we get those nice sharp edges. And if you start to feel like you're getting a little overwhelmed by doing all of the edges and saying what's the opening and what isn't, even if you don't have a lot of paint on your brush, you can just scrape in the middle area here. That way you know that that area isn't an opening, and you can go back over it in a minute when you have more pigment. But this is just a very quick way of getting down where you want pigment to be and where you don't want it to be. we go. I'm just going to continue to fill out my rock down here at the bottom. You are more than welcome to draw it out, to use the traceable, or just to wait for me to do this, and then you can maybe pause the screen and draw it in yourself. Entirely up to you, but I'm just going to fill this in, and then I will see you in a second. So here we have the bottom of the piece, and again, this is all going to be rock with the open areas being reflective water showing all of the clouds, light, and the sky. What I would recommend when you're doing this is make sure that all of your edges are nice and sharp. We will probably have to go over them one more time, but it's good to get it right the first time. That way it's a little bit easier later on. With that said, before we move on to the water, make sure that this is fully dry. And again, if you're not using the traceable, just, pause the video right now, sketch this out, and then, we can all kind of continue together. So with that, before we continue, also, I am going to clean my water and my brushes because I'm going to head back up here, start using some brighter pigments, and I don't want the darker pigments to kind of dilute all of that. So I'm going to go clean all of that, and then we'll be right back. I'm going to head back into this with the smaller 1/4 inch flat-headed brush, and I'm going to mix up a little bit of a pink to start. Just like that, a little bit of Mars Black, and then a hint of blue. We will start applying that right under here, and if you look at this in comparison to that, they are quite far off. This is much more of a bluish purple, this is much more of a reddish purple, and that's not what we want. We want a nice reflection. So, as opposed to just continuing to use that, we're going to take some extra cerulean blue, mix that in there, and we can even test it up over there, see if we like it. This is essentially what we want. It's a little bit darker than our previous application there, but the water is generally darker than the sky, so that's okay. Now we have this nice peachish pigment already incorporated, so I'm going to go over that just slightly with a very watered down pigment. That way we can build a gradient from one to the next, like that. Get a little bit more here. And we will be going back over the top again. I just wanted a little bit of a transition area. We will also mix that with our cadmium red light hue, cadmium yellow deep hue, titanium white, and we'll give this a try. It's a little bit more orange than we want, so we'll take more white, we'll take more red, and this is actually, I'm glad this is happening. You notice that our last two pigments didn't go exactly how we wanted. It's important to recognize, regardless of how much practice you have, eventually there will be pigments that just aren't mixing to be what they need to be, and you will have to change them, and that's okay. It happens to all of us. What's important is that you keep painting, you keep trying, and you work towards what you really want. And that's what we're doing here. So we're trying a couple of different pigments, a couple of different blends. The more I do here, the happier I get with it. I'm finding this really bright pigment is working quite well because we are working with a darker purple, and that is bringing down the value a little bit. Now as I start to move over here to the right hand side, I am going to make more of a bluish mixture with just a hint of our red. And that's because we are moving farther and farther away from that light, and we're no longer going to get that direct orange. So here, as you can see, we do get to make something a bit different. And I'll apply that right over here. You can see that we have a lot of colors going on in this area. The goal will soon be to blend them all fairly evenly. But while I'm applying this, I just want to make sure that I get some nice sharp lines along our rocks and everything else. You also probably just noticed that the camera, that the shot here, got a lot brighter. I was painting a lot of clouds in the sky. The sun just came out and it had quite the effect on the painting. And this is something I like to note in just about all of my lessons. It's great to paint on days that are semi-cloudy, semi-sunny, because they let you see your painting in both situations. So when you hang it up in your house or apartment, you know what it'll look like on both types of days. But there we go. As we move farther and farther away from that background, we can make things a little bit darker. So I'll add some extra Mars black into that mixture, throw that into the bottom. And while I'm trying to work fairly precisely around the edges and the rock that we incorporated, it doesn't have to be perfect. I fully intended to go back over all of the edges of our rock. The only reason we did it before our water here was so that we didn't lose any of that line work and we knew exactly where everything was going to be. So here you can see I'm doing a little bit of a blend. And I don't want to move the blue too far over anymore, so instead I'm going to go back to the purple and the orange, and I will bring that on top of the blue. There we go. Getting closer. Give that a try. It's not bad. A little bit more red. A little bit more white. And that's perfect. Farther right we go, the more blue it gets. Now I adjusted the lighting on the camera so you had a bit of a more accurate representation of what this looked like right now. And I just want to smooth out that area. So I'll grab a little bit of yellow, quite a bit of red, and titanium white. At this point you don't want to use a yellow heavy mixture because we've been using a lot of blue and it could easily turn into a green right now. And we don't want the green in our water. It looks great in the trees over here, but that's really the extent of what we want there. I'll also add a little bit of light working its way between these two rocks, and a little bit more on this side as well. I'm having slightly difficult time blending it, so I'm going to make my brush a little bit more damp, add some extra water to it, and that's much more smooth. Good. And you can see the shadow from that rock and that one right there. So here we have a little bit of a wider shot so you can see how it's blending from afar, and so far I am really pleased with this. Next we're going to take more of these colors and apply them in here. So now I'm moving a little bit farther down. We will mix up a bit more of our purple with some blue, some red, quite a bit of titanium white, and a little bit of Mars black. I feel like that might be a little bit too gray, but we'll give it a test to apply it right here because that's essentially what we're continuing off of. I do feel like it's a little bit more gray than we want, so a hint more red and a hint more blue make a big difference. It's definitely better. And I'll start applying this right down here. Again, if you go over the almost black areas, that is okay. You can also create all new little spots if you want. This is a great time to just kind of explore, play, create, extra patches and watery areas, should you want to. Don't have to. Also connecting a couple of them, which is quite fun. Still using that 1/4 inch flat-headed brush, just because it's so nifty. There we go, and I'm not going to move the purple over any farther because at that point we really do want it to turn into much more of a blue. That said, I am going to add a hint of yellow and red, much more red than yellow because this is a slightly blue mixture and we don't want it to turn green. Something you'll hear me say 100 times in these lessons, but it's amazing how even I still forget once in a while. And here I'm just adding a little bit more warmth to that color. It's amazing what just a hint of an extra little wash can do. Yeah, it's really nice. Okay. Now at this point we're going to start painting the reflections of these clouds. So I'm going to move the camera back a little bit, that way you can see this and the clouds at the same time. So for this next step, I'm switching back to the larger round-headed brush that has a slight point to it because again, it's ideal for painting clouds like that. And for this, I'm going to be color matching with what we've already have established on the painting. So I know that this area roughly was what we used to create those clouds. So I'm kind of starting there, creating a color that's similar to what we have on the palette. And you know what, I'll give this a little test up there. It's good. I think you could use a slight hint of titanium white. And that's really close. So now that I have it, I'm going to start building a little bit of a base in here. And I'm going to start with the main forms. Beginning with these, because it's going to help me not get lost with everything that's happening. And it'll just make it a little bit easier. Now I know that the body of it needs to be a bit more blue and a bit darker. So Mars black, cerulean blue, need more titanium white. There we go, a little bit of red. Give that a test. It's darker than what we have up in the clouds, but I actually want something a little bit more stark because we are at the bottom here and we're getting closer to us in the foreground, so I want to start making things a little bit more saturated, and I also want to increase the values a bit more so we have a bit more contrast. That generally happens in real life. Things that are farther away have more amalgamated colors and values. And when things get closer to you, you have a much more accurate view of what things actually look like. So, that's what we're kind of focusing on here. Now I see there's a cloud. That'll be right here. Paint that in. There's a little bit of an opening between them, so I'll leave that. And here you can see I'm actually starting with the darker pigment rather than the lighter purple pigment. And that's because the higher up in the cloud, the more bluish dark pigments you get. And so here, the farther down you go, the more bluish dark pigments you get. We can still mix and use a brighter purple as well and just go along the edges. But just remember that we used different color combinations in the top, and so we're going to want to do that in the bottom here as well. There we go. Then we have quite a bit of bright pigment, so titanium white, cerulean blue, hint of Mars black. There we go. And that was right in between. Now this is all quite rough. It's only our first layer, and at this point I'm just trying to get the colors where I want them, the shapes where I want them. I'm not too worried about detail or sharp application. So I've been continuing to paint this for the last hour or so, just kind of moving everything from the top down here. And I wanted to take a little break to note this part right here, because this is the larger cloud, and what I'm starting to do is I'm letting it dissipate. So what we have here is a fairly accurate representation of what we have up in the sky, as is this. We have some sharper applications, some notable line work, but with this, the farther down we go, the darker we get, because the sky is getting darker and darker, and the shape and the form in the cloud is getting lesser and lesser. So for this, I'm going to take my damp brush. We'll mix up some of that bluish purple. At this point it's almost fully blue because we are getting to the tops of those clouds. We have quite a bit of Mars black, titanium white. I'll give this a try. I think it'll probably be too bright. Definitely too bright. So a little more red, a little bit more black. Give that a go. And here you can see it's working quite well. But as we move down, I want my paint to run out. I want the blend to get softer and softer to the point where there really isn't a definitive line. And the best way of going about this is starting up at the top in the body of the cloud. So I'll work my way there, and then I'll start moving down. And by the time I get down here, I don't have enough pigment on my brush to make anything definitive or notable. I'm essentially adding color and a little bit of a brush stroke. So you get this really nice blend, and it's so beautiful when you combine something that is a bit more strict and something that's a bit more loose. I feel like they really help bring each other out, where if you had all loose or all strict, you'd probably have something that is taken for granted a little bit because you don't see it in contrast with anything else. So by doing it this way, they're both noticeable. The piece is more diverse, more interesting, and I'm also stretching the reflection a little bit at this point. I'd also like to note that I'm going to make this, these, and that all a significantly darker blue, probably closer to this. And I'm going over all of this a number of times because we did up in the sky. So this is a process that I decided not to film in its entirety because you did see me paint this, all of it up in the sky, and it does take quite some time. So rather than giving you, 6 to 8 hour video, I figured we would teach the techniques, let you go ahead and just kind of copy the sky, but when the sky is different, we will make note of it and come down. I'd also like to note, again, when things are different, that you can take blues and work them back into here if you happen to make it a little bit too prominent. So here we have a little bit of a wider shot, and as you can see, I've gone ahead and made the edges significantly darker. I filled in all of those little spots, and I've probably continued working on this for another 30 to 45 minutes. At this point, I am really quite happy with the colors and the transitions, and I'm ready to proceed to the next subject. However, before we do so, I do want to touch on the general rules of rendering this reflection, because I do recognize I've been jumping around a little bit in this. I'm not including all of it, because again, I do feel like it would probably be a little bit tedious. But let's talk rules, because I do think this is something you can take with you into future lessons, and it'll just make everything so much easier. So to start off, rule number 1, we are essentially just taking the sky and we are flipping it. We are then making it slightly darker than the sky because the water is generally a little bit darker. Then I'm making the closest area here to the horizon the sharpest. So the rendering of these clouds right here is quite similar to what we have in color and in shape. But as I start to move higher up in the sky, lower down here in the water, I start to make more changes. And as you can see, these two clouds right here have been elongated and they're a little bit more abstract. I also start to eventually blend it into the rest of the water. That way it isn't a perfectly clear reflection and you have something else interesting about it, right? It isn't just a perfect match and it does make it feel like it's moving towards you. So that's really the biggest change in regards to form. That which is closest to us is a bit longer, it's a little bit more distorted, and the opacity does blend with the rest of the water here. I also again made the edges relatively dark to create more of that vignette effect and bring the eye in towards the middle. But if you follow those general rules, you should have a really easy time doing this. And if you do find it kind of confusing painting a sky upside down, you can just flip your canvas and paint it like a regular sky. And again, it's significantly easier. So those are a couple ideas, a couple tips. I'd also like to note, I did go over the majority of this water 2 to 3 times, just readjusting things, playing with things. That's another reason I didn't decide to, or rather I decided not to film all of it. It would just be really, really repetitive. So those are my thoughts, those are my ideas. Now we are going to work on our little land masses here, make those edges nice and sharp, and do a little bit of reshaping, because now that we see all of the reflections, I know what areas are a little bit too simple, what areas need a little bit more, and we can play with that. So let's get a little bit closer and jump back into it. So yet again, I'm going to be using the smaller flat-headed brush. Again, this one is about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to be grabbing a good amount of Mars Black, a little bit of Titanium White, good amount of our Cadmium Red, and then about an equal amount of our blue. And this will render quite a dark purple, and it should be quite similar to what we initially had. So now that we have our pigment, we're just going to start reshaping and sharpening our edges. As you can see, a lot of them were actually lost in that painting process, and some of them are actually fully covered by our blues. So we just want to make sure that none of this looks blurry. We want to make it look nice and fine, and I'll also move back in, because remember, we have all of these smaller openings and we want them to be nice and defined as well. So we're using this brush because it does have that incredibly sharp edge, and that's quite useful right here. I'm also making changes. So we had our initial areas of light, but now I can see that we really do have quite a lot. So I'm going to be a little bit picky, and we're going to darken some of those. The reason we're doing that, and we're not having a grand amount of water and light in that area, is simply that it doesn't become overwhelming. Generally, things look the most beautiful when they have a lot of pieces and elements complementing them, when they have something to stand out against. And if we just had all of this bright pinkish water, then it really wouldn't pop, because all of it would look the same. Here we have this darker background that it can stand out against, and it can really look special. So we're just being a bit more selective. And an issue I'm currently finding myself in, it's important to be honest about this, is that if you look at it, once my palette is out of the way, these are all fairly similar shapes. Make sure that you have lots of different shapes, different sizes. The worst thing this can be is continuously the same thing. There we go. If you feel like you take out too many, that is okay. Later on we can go back in and add more. And you know what, I think that's what I'll probably end up doing. But it is one of those things you can kind of work back and forth with. Here I'm back along the edges, making those nice and sharp. There we go. And moving inwards. If you find that your brush is starting to feel a little bit dry, then do make sure you go back and edit it, get some extra water, because it really will help with those sharp lines. As you can see, this area down here got really quite messy. So we'll need to do quite a bit of work reforming this. And once we've done all of these edges yet again, we can also start interjecting additional pieces. So I'd just take some extra pigment. I'd find a spot I feel is a little open, a little barren, and I'll throw in a couple of additional little rocks of varying shapes and sizes, just like that. These are going to add a lot of character to the painting, and I highly advise being playful with them. The more you add, honestly, the more interesting it'll be. And if you use a smaller brush, you will find that it's significantly easier to get original and interesting applications. I think we'll do one right out here. So now I'm jumping over into this area right here with this smaller pointed brush because it does have a nice fine tip to it. And I'm going to work in this area because this and this were a similar size and shape, and I wanted a bit more diversity. So we're going to interject some additional little rocks in there. I'm starting with quite a damp brush. So we'll take more of that dark pigment we've been using, and I'll look at what I have here and I'll kind of try to make little paths of rocks. So this is coming down, it's coming down that way, this is moving in, so I'm kind of combining those movements and working in this direction. I'll also create a bit of a larger rock here because we created 3 rocks of a similar size, and I don't want to continue making it too similar. So we're just going to diversify a little bit there and continue playing with it. We still want to leave different blues and pinks showing through. We still want this to be a body of water, but I do want it to be relatively different from what we have right there. So I'm jumping around, that way I don't make one area too complicated. And that's also another good tip. If you're kind of following these lines, you're working in a certain area, do try to move around a little bit. That way you have time to kind of digest what you just did before you continuously add to it and possibly overdo it. It's easy to kind of get caught up in the moment and not look at that area in context with everything else. And it's great to, move to a different spot, give it some time, and then come back to it if you do find you want to continue working or playing with it. I took a little break, just talking, said, you know what, I think we could use one more right down there. I do like that. I think I could sharpen that, maybe extend it a little bit. I like that. And now we really filled in that, so this open area here looks a little bit awkward. So we will add to it as well. And that's really the painting process. It's doing one area and then saying, okay, I like that a lot, does it match everything else? If yes, great. If no, do you want to change everything else, or do you want to change it? And there isn't really a right or wrong answer to that. It's really up to you in each individual situation. And the answer should change fairly regularly. So there, we'll just add a couple, like that. Not too many, not too few. And we'll also create some along this edge that kind of wrap down. I painted these initially and I can still see the pigment a little bit through the blue that we painted, and that again is why we started with that darker base. So we could find things if they got lost. Also going to reshape the top of this so it feels a little bit larger, a little bit more bold. So I'm just going to bring this down. And already I like that so much better. Wow. There we go. This is coming along so well. Each time I apply these in a different area, I kind of move my head back so I get to look at it as a whole, and then I jump back into it. That way again, I get a little bit of a wider perspective and I can see how everything's working together. Or how it's not working together. Now that I'm happy with the majority of my edges, I'm going to come back up into this area and rework a couple of these highlights. So we're going to use a very small tipped brush, as you can see here, and yet again we want to mix more of that purple, but this time we want to make it quite a bit brighter than our past mixtures, because at this point we are going to be applying it over almost a black, and that, of course, will show through. So here I have quite a bright pigment. I'll test it on the actual color that I want to extend to know that it is correct. And once I have that, we got lucky with our first blend, I'm going to start extending this out and creating some more original shapes in here. Because the issue I had initially was that it was just a lot of the same patches, and I wanted a lot more diversity. So here, by going back in, we can rework it, and we can make sure that we don't make those same mistakes. I'm also going to go over a number of these areas a couple of times to build up those highlights. If you find that you are having issues building up those highlights, just let the initial application dry. Sometimes the biggest issue we have with blending is just that we have too much paint. Things get a little bit too complicated, there's more pigment than we need, and it can become difficult to layer. Even waiting an extra 2 or 3 minutes can make a big difference. But there, as you can see, it's really starting to come together. Still a lot of horizontal applications, but they're connecting in varying ways now. So much happier with it already. I don't want to just focus on that space though, so we'll also move over here. But I can't move too far because we'll lose that pink reflection fairly soon. So we need to be careful with that. Don't like that one, so I'm going to try to scrape it off with my finger. Then I'll take a purely wet brush, just go over that with a lot of circular marks. Again, use my finger and it's gone. So this process is really quite friendly in that it's rather difficult to mess up and then have to really deal with said issue, because it's just so quickly and easily remedied. There we go. Now at this point, I'm quite happy with all of our pooled water, and we're going to start working on building some depth in our rocks here. We're going to continue using this brush, but we've been using the same water for quite some time. I'm going to go give that a clean, and then we'll head back into this and really mold these into something a bit more realistic rather than pure silhouettes. So I will see you in just a second, and this of course is your friendly reminder to clean your brushes and water. So this is where we're going to get extremely meticulous with our applications. We're going to make hundreds of very small impressions to make these look like rocks. And we're going to start in the distance and work our way forward. With these, I want to mix a purple, so I'll use a little bit of white, red, blue, and because we're starting in the background, we're going to make this a red dominant purple. As we move forward, we can make it a bit more blue, but right now we want something a bit warmer. Now this pigment, I want it to be brighter than the dark rock, but a little bit darker than the water. And in the distance, it's just going to look like hundreds of little taps. Little rocks that are a little bit wet maybe, catching the smallest amount of light. And for the first little while, it won't really look like anything, and you'll probably feel inclined to make it significantly brighter, more notable. Don't do that. Keep it subtle. On larger rocks, you can do full strokes. So there you can see the lights coming this way, so I made those diagonal applications, and then I say, you know what, there will be a bit of a shadow there, so this area will be quite dark, but this area is more flat, so it will just get those taps. And this is going to be a series of rocks. There's a little bit of an indent and a divot there, so I say, you know, we can have a little bit of a break in our rocks, like that. Grab more pigment. It's also worth noting that my pigment is very watered down right now, because there's a lot of water on my brush, which is making it semi-transparent, which is nice because it's making it not that prominent, but it's also allowing me to apply really sharp applications. Remember, we want this to be darker than the water. So here we'll get a little bit closer, and I'll show you the technique again. We're going on the tops of our rocks where the light's going to be hitting, and then we're making a little bit of a slide with our brush, and then we're finding a new area. Occasionally these will connect and will form new sections of rock, but that's why it's so imperative that this is darker than the water, because if it isn't, it can all start to mesh and kind of visually blend together. We don't want that. We want something that's distinctive. There we go. Just the smallest little touches. And whenever you create a larger application or line, recognize that the area right under it / behind it is going to be darker. So I'm going to skip a little spot here, and then I'll make it brighter after that. Because remember, the light's coming this way, it'll catch the tops of these little rocks, and then they will cast a shadow right behind them. Now this will have to be done over here and over here, but I do want to show you how it transitions. So we have more of that pigment here, and remember, it's very small in the distance, but as we get closer to us, all of these rocks start to look a lot bigger because of perspective. So now I'm making significantly larger strokes. This one's covering the top of this rock, and then I'll say, okay, you know, it has a shadow, so I'll create another rock right here. This can be a rock. This rock is a highlight. This is the darker backside of it. This one can kind of connect with this one, leaving opening darker areas, but you can see that the brush strokes are just expanding in size. We still want the top of each brush stroke to be nice and sharp, and then what we might do is go down to the bottom of them with just a damp brush and blend it a little bit. That way it has a sharp top and a soft bottom. Like that. And then we can kind of work our way back up here, and eventually they'll connect. So we want to slowly transition into smaller strokes, something a little bit less prominent, and it'll start to make a lot more sense. This is something you can take significantly more time with than I currently am, but I don't want the video to be too long for you. Just recognize the more time you put into this, the more original you can make these, the more interesting you can make it, the more detailed. So don't feel like you have to work at my pace. Generally with painting, slower is better. Now, on the edges here, you can see these larger rocks that I've started to incorporate. And this one's just about done, but I wanted to show you how we build up that highlight and how that light wraps around a rock. So we're going to do this one right here. I'm still using that small brush. We are going to grab quite a bit of titanium white, a little bit of red, significantly less blue, and we'll mix up a nice pinkish highlight with, of course, the smallest touch of Mars Black. Then I will find my edge, and I might actually create one. So here you can see I'm just working along, and this highlight is arguably a little bit brighter than what we have over here, but that's okay because it's so far removed. It might be a little bit of an artistic liberty, but it's going to render the most aesthetic results. So I start with that one nice clean line. Then I'm going to take the paint off my brush, make sure that it's just nice and damp, and with a little bit of a swirling motion, I'll work the back edge of this inwards. That way we have a sharp top, a blended back, and now you can see that light on the edge is working its way back this way. I'll grab a little bit more, and I'll create another little divot or edge, another protruding piece here and there. So if an area is darker, it means it dips in and the light can't get it. And then if it becomes brighter again, that means that area is extended upwards and it's catching more light. And you can start working this back, creating openings, fissures. And just like that, we have a very colorful, bright rock. Now, yet again, I take that paint off my brush, I start to work the pigment backwards, and this looks significantly brighter and more saturated than this right now, but that's only because this pigment is currently wet and it's reflective. So it's getting a lot of extra light, and as it tends to dry, it will get darker, it'll look a little less saturated, you'll see those darker pigments showing through more. But if you're ever worried that it's just not going to be consistent, you can take more of that pigment and you can work it into other subjects to make sure that things will in fact be consistent. Here you can see it really isn't a big change on this rock, but now we know for sure that they will match. You can also take a darker version of that pigment and you can work your shadows back into it if you'd like to. So if you have too much light in an area or you simply want to make a change, you can do that. I generally like to do this working from the back, the body of it. I work my way inwards, and that way I can make sure that edge remains nice and sharp and I have a bit more room to play with the gradient. But if we add all of that highlight to that area, then we do need to make a gradient of light leaving it. So yet again, I make my highlight, grab a bit more blue. I'll say, okay, was applied on this rock. Now we need to work it over a little bit. So I'll look for all of these other rocks, give them just a touch more light. And here I'll do a couple more quickly, just to show you, but again, don't feel like you need to rush through this. This is just to give you an example of how it all works together. Now let's head down into this area, and as I get farther away from the light, I am going to work more blue into my highlights. Make sure that my brush is nice and damp. And then I'll say, okay, we have a rock structure here. I can find an edge here. I'll work up that edge, and then I'll just kind of connect it to what we've previously installed and try to give it another interesting shape. Again, I'm blending back a little bit, and I might create a little bit of another structure there. Now I'll get more pigment. I'll find this edge, and you generally want to work your way up different edges, and I'll make this one a bit more shallow. Then here's another edge, we'll work on that, and I'll make this come up here. Maybe it'll connect on that side, maybe it'll break off and there'll be a second piece to it. And these rocks are going to be significantly bigger, or at least they're visually going to look that way because they're closer to us and we'll be able to recognize detail. So here I'm kind of jumping around using this little pitter patter with my brush. And then eventually I'll say, okay, you know what, this is going to be the edge of this rock. So I'll start another rock here, and you can see that dividing dark area between the two. So I started with my line, I'm working my way back, there are lots of taps in varying directions, and then you know what, we'll put another one right here. And yet again there's a separation. You don't want to create too many similar separations, but right now I think that's a fair amount. So yet again, I'll start on that edge, I'll work my way in, down, like that. I might go back and add a little bit of an extra highlight. Remember, building those highlights does take time and layers. Really work our way back up here, I guess. Just seemed to have happened. Work that highlight back a little bit more. Remember, the light shining this way, so everything facing the light is going to be quite bright, especially the edges, and then the backs of each rock are going to be quite dark. We'll let this one be rather tall. Work the light down this side as well. And soon I think we'll need a little bit more paint. But not quite yet. I'll also create a bit more of a flat rock right here. But we're not going to extend it that far back because this is going to cast quite a large shadow on whatever rocks are right here. And so this one's going to be a bit more short. And when we have almost no paint left, then we can work our way back there and create a very subtle showing of it. Starting to run out of paint, so I'll create a softer blend of this back as well. And now that I have almost nothing on it, maybe we can start putting a little bit of detail back here. Now we were just working on a rock quite close up, so now I'm going to switch to one a bit farther away. That way, you know, we remember that there are differences in techniques and we retain those. So I'll take a bit more of my cadmium red, hint of our blue, quite a bit of our titanium white, work that in there, and a hint of our Mars black. We'll head up to the side of this rock, add that highlight, but we're not going to see all of the details that we did down there. So now I'll just start painting the top of another rock, and another rock, and another rock. You can see it's much more simple, and that's really how it needs to be. If you were to try to add all of that detail into the background here, you wouldn't really be able to focus on one area, and you'd just be stealing attention away from all of the hard work you did. It's important to recognize that not every area should be hyper detailed, and that your painting actually can garner more attention by having focused, detail-heavy areas. Now I'm going to create a brighter version of what I just had. I'll head back to my edges, build that up a little bit. There we go. Remember, some of these rocks will connect. It's going quite nicely. Now, in the last lesson, I tended to say tap, tap, tap quite a bit. And I asked everyone in the comments who made it that far to say tap, tap, tap. That way I could see who is really making it to the end of these videos and who is really invested. Is really trying to learn as much as they could. And I thought that was really fun. I was amazed by how many people did that. So I think we'll need to find something for the end of this lesson. We'll need a new phrase. I'm going to think about that over the next minute or two while we just kind of go back in and continue to shape these rocks in the distance. You know, I really do appreciate everybody who's still watching. I think it's an honor that you are spending your time here with me, especially when we do these more detailed, longer paintings. And I really hope that you feel like you're learning a great deal, that you leave these inspired, ready to make something you truly care about, and ideas for the future as well. This is really starting to come along here. I'd also like to, as always, say a big thank you to everyone who's supporting the channel over on Patreon. It is only because of you and your support that I am able to make these lessons, especially these complicated, longer ones. I wouldn't have the time if it wasn't for you, and really appreciate it. Feel like that's something you deserve to hear in every one of these videos, and you know, thank you. If you'd like to also support the channel, you can do so up over on Patreon. I have 5 ebooks. One is Acrylics for Beginners, which just teaches the essentials. The others are full of traceables. And up there I also always post a traceable to all of the new lessons each week. Generally there's a reference photo. I also have a back catalog of over 50 lessons. We have an exclusive Facebook group where we share our work. So there's a lot going up there. Also personalized art critiques for the higher tiers. Those are always a lot of fun to make. But if you'd like to join, if you are interested in any of those options, they are available. There's a link in the description. But you know, I also just appreciate you sticking around, watching the videos. It means a lot. And also, I've noticed a lot of people sharing the videos as of late. That helps the channel immensely. I really can't thank all of you who are posting these on your Facebook, your Twitter, all of that. Gets the channel out there, gets more people inspired, ready to paint. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. So thank you to everyone who, you know, does support the channel up over on Patreon. Thank you to everyone who shares the videos. Thank you to everyone who has simply made it this far in the video. There we go. You know, when I start talking about that, when I start thinking about that, honestly, I get so inspired, and I feel like the painting gets so much better for it. The detail that we've added in the last 3 minutes or so, I feel is really pulling this together. It's not the same level of detail that we have down there. It's a different type of detail, but fantastic. I'm going to try to balance it now, work to the other side, and just do more of that rock building. Now we'll head right back down here to the bottom and establish some larger rocks. So, yet again, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, some red, and a bit more blue than we've been using because we are getting farther away from that light. But we don't want it to be a pure blue. So, that right there looks quite nice. I'm going to take the excess paint off my brush, head in here, grab a bit more of that. And remember, we like to start on the edges, so follow that edge down, and then we'll work our way back a little bit. We'll follow this edge down, work our way back a little bit. This one has a bit of a sharper edge, which I think is quite interesting. A lot of these have triangular edges. Remember that they shouldn't always be the same. By going back over areas, we of course build up the opacity. We make these strokes much more noticeable. And in turn, we also add dimension to it as well. We only applied one layer to a lot of this, so we actually have a lot to build on. This one's quite interesting because it's facing that way, so the head of it, the top here, will be quite bright. Anything that protrudes will be quite bright, and then the rest of it in the back will remain dark. Here, just doing a myriad of small taps just to build in some extra texture, give it a bit more of a rough exterior. Eventually you may find that you apply so many details that they start to kind of collect and become larger areas, and that can actually be quite nice. I like that one a lot. But again, we start on the edges. We can work our way in, create some interesting new shapes. And make all of these rocks a little bit different. So now I've just about finished applying the highlights to all of the rocks. You can see that these ones are quite large here, and that they're also significantly more blue than the ones that we have up there. But I do still want a slight hint of that warm highlight working its way along the edge. So I'm going to take a little bit more of our cadmium red, a little bit more of the blue, but we're going to make this red dominant, titanium white, hint of Mars black, and now I'm going to find that edge of all of these slightly more blue rocks, and I'll just give them a small hint of pink. I'm not working all the way down. It's not like I'm trying to cover a line. I'm also doing occasional little taps on the inside, but this is just going to further diversify our colors down here, but also make them significantly more cohesive with that of what we have at the top. It's going to make the area in which we feel as if we're standing feel a little bit warmer. It's also going to give us an opportunity to make some of these applications, like that one, just a hint sharper. I love this. Always love blue and pinks together. And here we get an opportunity to play with them in a very subtle manner. Generally, I think they're much more intense, and there's a real beauty in the subtlety of them. Look at that. Just a little bit of light catching the edge of the rock, illuminating where you stand. Something else I'd like to note is when a lot of us are painting rocks, or really anything, and we're painting dark to light and we're slowly building it up, a lot of people tend initially to paint that dark layer and then they'll start painting that highlight and they'll be afraid of going over the edge of that dark area. So right now I have a hint of black right there. It's very minuscule, you probably don't see it, but what's really important is that you take that highlight and you fully cover that dark area, because then it looks like the light's coming this way and then for some reason it doesn't actually catch the edge, which is where it should be brightest and the most prominent. So make sure you continuously double check your edges where light is hitting them and make sure that it is prominent and that you do not have a darker outline because the underlayer is showing through. It'll make a massive difference in your painting. And again, if you do this, don't worry about it. Almost absolutely everybody does at some point. It's just one of those things we all have to learn. And once we do, our paintings are much better for it. Now for another really subtle but beautiful technique, we're going to take our blue, our titanium white, and a hint of our Mars black. And we're going to mix these together until we get a highlighted blue that isn't all that bright. We just want it slightly brighter than the water. And we're going to find the edge of our rock on the bottom, and we're just going to create a little line. Doesn't look like my blue is quite bright enough, so add a hint more titanium white, hint more of our blue. We'll go back in, try that again. There we go. And this is just going to be a very subtle reflection. There might be a slight movement in the water. It's causing it to move up on the rock and catch this very subtle highlight. And this can actually be done with just about all of these. Just make sure that your stroke is incredibly small and precise. And I'll go over a couple of them a number of times. There we go. But again, I think a lot of people initially, they make this a pure white. Don't do that. Make it just a little bit brighter than what the blue is, the mid blue that you have there. And that'll be enough. You want it to accent the piece, you don't want it to become the only thing noticeable in the piece. Now I'm just going to head back up and work on a couple of these rocks. But remember, we're very close to the light now, so I'm actually going to use more of an orange for this reflection. I'm going to use a little bit more red than yellow because we are working on top of black, and if we were to use that yellow, we might end up with something that looks a little bit green. So right here, we'll give this a go. Apply it to the sides. It's very subtle. It's just a hint of warmth. Apply it to both sides. And then we'll apply it to the left-hand side of these ones. Just like that. We don't need much detail there, just a little bit. It's far away, but we will build it up a hint more. Some more titanium white, heading back to that edge, creating as sharp of a line as I can. Doing that for all three of these ones. And those are probably too far away for this highlight. Now I'll take that paint off my brush, make sure it's nice and damp, and we'll do a little bit of a blend back and inwards. Might also take just a hint of that orange, like that. It's a bit more pink, but that is ideal. And I'll work that over some of these edges as well, just the ones closest to the light. Further diversify those colors, add an extra layer of detail. Just try not to overdo it. This is meant to be subtle. Here you can see what these details and highlights look like from a little bit of a distance. I've started to expand them out a bit farther than what we initially did, but I'm still trying to keep it in this top portion of the painting. I'm also trying to use semi-transparent layers. That way the pinks and the purples still show through. Gives us a more interesting palette and just a more diverse painting overall. But anyways, I think there we have it. So stepping back here for the final time with this lesson, I am just astonished by the amount of detail, the amount of brushstrokes you're able to pack into such a small lesson, to such a small canvas. This really was quite an extensive lesson. I can't recall the last time we spent this much time on a painting. It would probably have to be the large Valhalla series that took, what, 2.5 months to create. So I am very pleased with this. I hope you feel wildly excited and inspired to go out and create your own magnificent lesson. And I really thank you for making it this far in the painting. I suppose we haven't yet come up with our word for getting this far though. You know, when I look at the painting, I feel like the word serenity comes to mind. So find a way to work that into your comment, or just end your comment with that. That way I know you got this far. It can be a little point of honor and pride, and you know, it's just super fun to see. So when you're leaving a comment, use the word serenity in it or at the end, and maybe that's what we'll call this one. But with that, I would like to say a big thank you to you for just getting this far. I think that is really, really, really cool. And I'd of course like to say a big thank you to all of our patrons for making this happen. It's something I want to say 100 times in each lesson, because honestly these lessons wouldn't happen without you. This channel is primarily fan funded, and you know, I spend a great amount of time each week working on these, and I wouldn't have that time without you financially supporting me and the channel. So truly thank you. I guess for those of you who are new to the channel and this is your first lesson, this channel is primarily fan funded. You can do so up over on Patreon. There's a link in the description, and up there you can get a bunch of exclusive content like all 5 of my ebooks, the traceables, the reference photos, access to our exclusive Facebook group, one-on-one little critiques. There's a bunch of fun stuff up there, and it's also just a great way to say thank you. And again, support the channel, help keep the lights on, as they say. And you know, it's not just a saying. I did happen to paint into the evening here. The lights are on, so thank you for literally keeping the lights on. I will see you next week with a brand new painting lesson. For those of you who aren't, make sure that you subscribe, but more importantly, hit the bell button. That way you're notified when the new lessons come out, and that way you don't miss anything. And I will see you next week. I am really, really excited. I love how we always end these, and I just feel, you know, ready to go and start a new painting. So I'm probably going to go plan a new one, and I will see you soon. Thank you so much for stopping by. Remember to leave that comment in the comment section, and as always, above all, stay creative.